Hello and welcome to Conscious TV and to my third episode or program on the series of important books. My name is Eleonora Gilbert, and today in the studio exploring important books in his life we have Guy Smith. Hello Guy.
Hi Eleonora.
Thank you for coming. And Guy is a body psychotherapist, an author, and also Guy has had a very interesting life and with the exploration of unity and self. And I wonder, before we start looking at the full selection of books that you have suggested, whether you can say something about that.
Yes, I mean, I sort of talked about this in the other program that I first got very much into spirituality and was interested particularly in the experience of unity and oneness, which can be a lovely experience, and people experience it in all kinds of different ways. And when I was experiencing in those terms, there was something very nice about it, but there were a couple of things that slightly disturbed me. One was I didn't feel that great in my body, and the other was that I didn't like some of the dynamics I saw within the spirituality scene, particularly with the inequality that there can be between the guru and the disciple. So I went on to then look into that, and I went into psychotherapy first.
Right. And
then I went into body psychotherapy. And when I was in normal psychotherapy, there was a lot of talk of self, and I was a little bit resistant to it because in spirituality we often talk about no self is the ideal or is the reality. And I couldn't get any grasp on self. But then I went into body psychotherapy training. And for them, the self is very simply the body.
Right. And
I could see, okay, I'm an embodied creature. I wasn't particularly embodied because I was very much in my mind to start with. And so I realized as I came into my body that I'd sort of been using spirituality a bit to avoid a lot of emotions in my body and kind of old things. And as I got more into my body, more of the emotions came up. I felt much more down to earth and much more normal as well. I didn't consider myself a kind of wonderful spiritual being or something, just like a human being. And I found that was the most satisfying thing. And so now I would say I experience a sense of unity as an individual self.
Right. Right. And that's important, because we still have the self.
Yes.
Always.
Yes.
No matter what.
Yes.
And so we're just going to start with the first book, and this is the Book of Secret by Osho, and I must say I had some reservation about this particular book just because of the hype around Osho, but I must say it's just a fabulous book. Would you like to say why you chose this particular book and what kind of impact it had on you? Yes.
Well, it's many years since I read it, but it kind of marked the beginning of my experiences with spirituality. And I think, I was just thinking, how do I put that now? Because my perspective's moved on such a long way since then. But I think he very much encourages people to experience reality directly. And this book is particularly about Tantra, which I think has a lot to do with experiencing through the senses. Basically, there's 112 techniques listed from a 5,000-year-old text, so it had that mystical intrigue, of ancientness. And they're very, very concise. They just say, for example, look at an object lovingly, or look at an object with your whole concentration, or pick up an object and feel it. And no elaboration, and no telling you what you should experience, or what would be a spiritual experience and what wouldn't be. It's just try this and see what happens.
Right.
And for me, that was so refreshing. And I think that it made life already begin to be a little bit more sensual for me, a bit more alive. And I started to realize how much we're trained to perceive things in a certain way.
Yes.
Perhaps dating back to, even sitting in a classroom and you have to sit still and be quiet, and all those natural impulses and feelings are kind of deadened, and you're taught to see the world in a objective way. You look at the globe and the atlas and so on, mathematical figures, you can very easily lose that direct contact with life. So I think that's what the book did for me, was it made me start to experience things directly and stop trying to perceive things how I had been taught I should see things.
And from the body perspective, because we talked earlier about
Yes.
that, was it helpful at all to you?
I mean, I'm sure it was. Wasn't really thinking in terms of the body then.
Sure.
But it's funny to look back because Tantra is very body orientated, and lots of the techniques are to do with hearing and smelling and touching, not just thinking and seeing. And often in spirituality we can use the word seeing a lot and insight, and it can come quite a kind of heady kind of thing. Or even consciousness can sometimes have a feeling of being a bit more up here.
Right.
So I think it did start to help. I can't remember
Sure.
precisely. I was more interested in all the strange energy effects I had when I was doing the experiments.
Yeah, from my experience of this particular book, I found that, should one feel in the need of something, just sometimes we get lost in our minds or lost in ego or whatever you want to call it. And it's a nice reminder. It's just kind of opening it at whatever page and just see what the lesson is in that particular page and just read about it, because I found it a great support.
Yes.
And I may be embarrassed to say that it sits by my bedside table just in case.
Yes.
It's like, okay, let's wake up to reading something about this.
Yes.
Was there anything else you wanted to add about this particular book? The importance in your journey?
I think there's something else that, strangely enough, I remember I liked the idea at the time, but I wonder if it stayed with me more than I realised. Because at one point he says that Tantra is the path of indulgence.
Yes.
And because he says, like, stereotypically you can be, if you're like a yogi or a meditator, you can have the sense of somebody really trying very hard to master something. Now, I don't think that's fair. I know yogis who are nothing like that.
Right.
But I think he sort of exaggerates it to make the point. But his idea with Tantra, I think, is that because you do what naturally feels pleasurable or that you have an impulse to do, that's a non-egotistical approach.
Right.
And I think, in a sense, the body self, the sense of self that comes simply from feeling your body, and that's how you know kind of what you're like as a person, isn't egotistical. It's very down to earth.
It's natural.
It's natural. And there's a real logic to that, because if I for example, if I believed that I had 3 legs, then walking would be very uncomfortable for me. If you came along and said, actually, Guy, you've got 2 legs, and I thought, okay, well, that's a strange belief, but I'm going to try it for a bit, and walking was suddenly more pleasurable, then that actually would be quite a good guide to truth, I think.
Right.
So psychoanalysts tend to split between the pleasure principle and the reality principle. The pleasure principle is that when you're very small, you follow what's pleasurable.
Yes.
And the idea is that when you get older, you have to grow up and start taking things seriously and not so much following that. But in a way, I think the idea of Tantra is that actually the pleasure principle and the reality principle can come together. If you do what feels pleasurable, it's likely that it's fitting with the way reality is. Whereas if you're really sure that you have 3 legs in this silly example that I'm saying, life's going to be a struggle for you. So I think those 2 concepts do come together.
That's great, yes. And there is no value in denying oneself when something is naturally arising.
Yes, why not make it pleasurable if you can?
Yeah. The next book, I must say, again, is Pattern of Madness by Neville Symington. And I really enjoy this book. It's all about narcissism. And as a matter of fact, whilst I was reading it for weeks, I was looking around myself, including me as well. Everybody seems to be narcissistic, at various different levels and of seriousness. So,
Yes.
Can you say something about this book and how has it been helpful to you in your journey?
Yes. Well, yes, he does have a very sort of elaborate system for narcissism. He sees it as the basis of all pathology. And his understanding is that actually there's only one pattern of madness. He calls it the Narcissistic Constellation. and that if we think of the whole list of different psychological conditions, even from autism to personality disorders, mood disorders, he says there's just one pattern, but in one person some symptoms will be clear but the others will be hidden.
Right.
So that's the concept of his book. I think, just the simplest thing, I actually think the bits where he talks about health I found particularly helpful.
Mm-hmm.
So it starts actually with a pattern of health.
Yes.
And I think whereas in the Osho book there was an encouragement to trust your own senses and to experience life through the senses, I think that Symington, he gives an analogy where he says a healthy way of perceiving things is like a painter standing in front of a landscape and painting it. But he says an unhealthy way, the narcissistic way, would be where you take a photograph, and he means a non-artistic photograph, so you
yes.
just quickly snap with
yes.
your Kodak disposable camera. And so his idea, I think, is that for us to be in a healthy state, we need to be, in a way, how we experience life has to be a creative act. It's not just something gets burned on our brain and then we act in a certain way. So it kind of, for me, it gave a lot of value back into thinking, not in a disconnected, compulsive kind of way, but just thinking creatively about things. And I think a little bit of me in the spirituality scene had kind of, it's easy where you kind of get glued, and this is part of his structure, you
yes.
get glued to a particular message or teacher or something, and then you identify with it, and then you start saying it to everybody, which he would call, part of his pattern of madness is called God.
Yes.
And he says that if you start, some people behave like they're God, they identify with this God figure in their mind, and other people project the God figure, and then they kind of glue yes. to that person. And for me, that explains something about the dynamics that can go on in not only spirituality, but psychotherapy trainings even,
yes.
I would find, and everywhere, in the workplace. And I found that really helpful to kind of step away from what I'd learnt and believed was true about spirituality and psychotherapy.
Right.
And to experience it, start to think, actually, what do I really think? And so it gave value back to the creative thinking again.
Good. I actually do, as a personal belief, that anybody who is studying to be a psychotherapist, or even a psychotherapist already qualified, should really read this book. I mean, that's my recommendation, just
yes.
because I think it's extremely valuable. It's a model,
yes.
so, it's not the truth, but certainly
No.
as a model is a very, very helpful model.
Yes.
Anyway, that's
yes.
how I found, that's what I found about this book. Now, the next book, again, it's by a very well-known therapist, Alice Miller, and this is For Your Own Good. It's quite shocking, this book. It's hurtful as well to see
yes.
how children, have been treated in the past. And I'm sorry to say even now in some cases. So specifically for you,
yes.
How do we move from the Osho, from
yes.
a pattern of madness to, the roots of violence in child rearing?
Yes.
What's your experience?
Yes, well, for me, I think of the 4 books, that's actually my favourite book and the one I'm most likely to still read. And Alice Miller, actually, she's not especially popular within the psychotherapy world because she writes very, very simply, and I think a lot of psychotherapists want to be academics in order to feel a bit more acceptable. That's my own view about it. But also she's quite critical of normal psychotherapy approaches. And I think even compared to A Pattern of Madness, as soon as I read Alice Miller, I feel immediately in my body and in my feelings. And I think, so again, if I'm looking for a common theme with Osho, it was the right to experience in your own way with your own senses. With Symington, it was being able to think about things creatively in your own way and trust that. With her, it's trusting your childhood experiences. And her view is that most people get completely cut off for actually how did it feel like to be a child in a house, and how that can easily feel like a state of captivity if somehow the little power that you have is being taken advantage of. And that if parents have been treated in that way, it's very easy for them to behave in a similar way to their children if they haven't worked through their own things.
Yes.
So for me, it really got me in touch with that, those past experiences.
Right.
And it's still, it's still happening. And I would say that was the most shifting thing that I've had, to really go back into myself, to go into my past. What was it really like to be in that particular situation?
Yes.
She's written a book as well called Breaking Down the Wall of Silence.
Yes.
And that's the most fiery of her books. And it did feel like that to me, like a wall of silence externally, because you can't, if you're not happy with how things are going, whether it's at school or with your parents or whatever,
Yes.
it's very hard to have anyone to talk to about it. And so you can easily just come to kind of hide it away and as the title of the book suggests, buy into what you're being told it's for your own good.
Yeah.
Which I think is very sad, because if something really doesn't feel very good for you, and then if you took that into a court and it was for example, a husband beating his wife, and then he said, well, it's for her own good, there's no way he could get away with it.
Absolutely.
But in terms of parenting and child rearing, it's still the case, I think, in the UK that it's legal, but it's a criminal offence in other countries, for example.
Right.
So for me, it was really good to get in touch with those really sort of powerful and painful issues. And I don't think it made me become very righteous and judgmental. I just think it made me feel connected and supported to myself and then to other people who've gone through that too.
So again, if we go back to what we said at the beginning in terms of the embodiment of your experience of unity and self, how helpful was that to go through your experiences as a child?
Really important, I think, like the crucial turning point, probably. It was, in a way, being treated as a body. So part of the biodynamic massage I was receiving, which is part of the body psychotherapy I do, was of being treated as a body mind, not as a person up here with a body,
right?
Or even not as consciousness with a body, but very much being in the body. But the other ingredient, I think, was having that real clear perspective on what's good for a person and what isn't, and how those can be twisted around, and we start to believe them because we need to get on and live in life so we can persuade ourselves of other things.
Yes.
So it allowed me to really connect with as I'm talking, there's lots of kind of tingling energy, because it's a relief to reconnect to those things that I just kind of put away, I think.
Yes, and many of us do put away.
Yes, I think it's the normal, that's the slightly scary thing.
Yeah.
I think there's a flavour in all those books as well about that actually it's a big societal thing. It's not just poor lone individuals, it's a thing that we're still reenacting.
Yes. Yes, and as a parent, if you are also run by your own history, you can only pass on that particular kind of history with more added on.
Yes.
So that's why I felt it kind of touching a raw nerve as a mother as well. It's like, ooh, what have I passed on, without even being violent towards my children. In fact, I wasn't, but there's so much that we do, we pass on. So, but the other thing also I wanted to add, that there's always also the danger of remaining in that particular place of your child's history and past negativity. So certainly it's been my experience, both in terms of spiritual groups as well as psychotherapy group, that there is this talking about it over and over and over and over and over again. And my belief now is that there is a point where you need to actually park those kind of experiences, because they've happened, rather than reenacting them, because that's what it feels like to me. There is the reenactment now of what happened in the past, but you're not the same person.
Yes.
Now you're very different. So I think there is a point whereby one needs to also perhaps let go of that. And I don't know if this is your experience too.
I think it's complex. I think Alice Miller's view, she particularly talks about, she says, she's very black and white about things. She says that forgiveness and forgetting is, she says it's a pseudo-religious concept and it doesn't mean anything. It's not an act of will to forgive. If somebody comes to you and they can see how they've affected you, and you can speak to them openly about it, then that happens. There's a healing happens,
Yes.
and then you connect and you feel equals again, and the power's
Yes.
broken down. So she thinks that if somebody's suffered, she talks about abuse, and it's a more taboo topic. In the trauma world, you can talk very easily about, a car crash, but if you talk about abuse, it's a very laden
Yes.
area.
Yes.
So, I think she's very clear on that, and to some degree it's been my experience, but I'm still working through that and trying to understand that.
Right. Okay.
Because it's no good just to become judgmental. It's very difficult. You don't want to betray your own past experiences
Sure.
you had to do if you're
Sure.
getting back in contact with it. But also, it's certainly something that I'm wrestling with. But generally, I'm a little bit unsure about the leaving it to one side and moving on, because I think when it heals, and that's what happens anyway.
Yes, there is an organic movement towards
Yes.
leaving it or
Yes.
parking it. I sometimes feel that some people have tremendous enjoyment about reenacting or reliving that particular thing, but it's probably something different.
Yes, I think that would possibly be a more like an acting out, like you say, and a reliving, but that's different from consciously going into
Yes.
it
And healing
and being
it.
able to. Yes,
Yeah.
that's different. I don't think
Yeah.
then you would reenact it. I think.
No,
you would-
I agree with that.
Yes.
But anyway, so moving on
Sure.
to the last book,
Yeah.
Planet Medicine by Richard Grossinger. It's a great big whopper of a book,
Yes.
but it's a great book as well. Tell us about this, and why have you selected it?
Yes. Well, this is a more recent book. It's so big because it deals with all different kinds of medicine, and he looks at medicine in a very broad way. So there's things from homeopathy and herbal medicine and shamanism. He includes psychoanalysis, although he questions how healing it is, but he thinks some of the theory and the insights were very good. He talks about Reiki and body psychotherapy, energy work, which is more where I connect to. But I think the thing I found quite revolutionary while reading it was that I think he emphasizes that that medicine can't be a science. Biology can be a science and chemistry can be a science, but medicine can't be, because there's far too much involved in getting ill and getting healthy.
Right.
And what do the symptoms mean? It's not that you're just a body, and the body isn't a machine, it's a living thing. There's a mind, there's relationships, there's energy, there's historical context. There's so many levels, and he continuously brings them all in without a hope of coming up with a massive system to solve
Right.
everything,
Right.
because I don't think that's possible.
Right.
But I think he just continually brings awareness to how much there is involved in being unwell and well. And one thing that was really helpful for me is that in the past, that usually I find going to the doctor quite a unsatisfactory experience. I
Yes.
sort of go and then they ask for my symptoms, I say the symptoms, and then they say, take this. And I think there's an emphasis in what he's saying on that the body is it's a living thing. You are your body. It's not an object in a textbook.
Yes.
So I think for me these days I experience health as being much more to do with, as a much more of a subjective thing. And obviously a doctor's trained just to see you as an object, and as a textbook object even,
Right.
it's a very generalised
Right.
object.
Right.
But my own experiences with health and development and vitality have been much more developed when I've been in a situation where the other person has been interested in me and not just symptoms.
Yes, yes.
And it's a very different experience.
Yeah, yeah, clearly, yes. Well, it's been really fascinating to read these books, and so I'd just like to quickly go through them again. So we have The Book of Secrets by Osho, then A Pattern of Madness by Neville Symington, For Your Own Good by Alice Miller, and lastly, but not leastly, Planet Medicine. Really a great read, fascinating read, and again, another one of these resource books to keep in one's bookshelves. Yeah. Guy, it's been a real pleasure. Thank you. Thank you very much for joining us, and thank you for watching Conscious TV, and hopefully we'll see you very soon. Thank you. Bye.